making the dumplings.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Carol Ann Church, the Director of Community Boards, at Brooklyn Borough Hall for Borough President Antonio Reynoso. It is now 6 p.m. and our session will start soon. Let's just give it, say, 3 to 5 more minutes to see if more of our colleagues are in the process of signing on. Thank you. Good evening once again. This is Carol Ann Church, Director of Community Boards, under the leadership of Borough President Antonio Reynoso. Thank you so much to all who've joined us here this evening for this workshop. Our colleagues at HPD graciously doing these sessions to help our board members gain the necessary knowledge to make the right decisions for their communities. This evening we have with us Charlie Rudoy. Charlie?
Hey, Carolyn. Hey, everybody. Should I get started?
Sure, introduce your team and you have sharing privileges, so you're good to go.
All right. Just sharing my screen. All right. Well, good evening, afternoon, everybody. My name is Charlie Rudoy. I'm a fair housing planner here at HPD. Um, and I'm also joined by my colleague, Renee Widdison, who is the Deputy Director of Neighborhood Planning here at HPD. Renee, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Um, yeah, so great to be here. I don't know if folks were here last session we did with the Brooklyn Borough President's Office, but we kind of had a introduction to affordable housing where we talked about HPD and the city's kind of approach to affordable housing, the housing crises in New York, and some of the tools that make housing affordable. But today we're kind of going to zoom out and go back in time a little bit and talk about fair housing, both the history of the struggle for equal rights in housing, and then also how discrimination plays out today in the city and how the city's fair housing plan where we live seeks to address some of these issues. Um, so let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so first I'll just say briefly about what is HPD. A lot of that is in the introduction to affordable housing presentation we gave, which I believe was recorded. Um, then we'll talk about fair housing. We'll talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is where all of you kind of get on board to help us with the vision for fair housing in the city. And just to note that if you're putting questions in the chat, we are saving them. So we're kind of just because of the format, there'll be interactive moments, but for your questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. My colleague is saving them into a document, and so at the end we will be able to answer questions. So first of all, what is HPD? Um, so a lot of folks' interaction with HPD is likely our very large team of code enforcement officers who are conducting inspections and issue violations. Most of our colleagues are inspectors here at HPD. So hundreds of thousands of inspections and violations a year. It might be lead, it may be heat related issues, etc. Um, a big thing we do is preserve and create new affordable housing. So since 2014, we've financed the constructions of tens of thousands of new affordable homes. And we kind of talked a little bit about what those can look like last time. But we've also preserved hundreds of thousands of homes. So, that doesn't get as much attention often as the new development, but this could look like someone who lives in their home and rents out a unit upstairs, needing money for renovations for the unit, to a very large apartment building affected by Hurricane Sandy, getting money to stay afloat, and in exchange, keeping affordability for the tenants who live there. Um, and lastly, we engage New Yorkers to build and sustain neighborhood strength and diversity. So that can look like neighborhood plans. Here in Brooklyn, we've had a Brownsville plan, which, we start with housing and kind of the potential assets for housing, but we go way beyond housing to talk about community connections, transportations, et cetera. And also a housing plan in Bed-Stuy. We hold resource fairs for both tenants and homeowners about the resources available to them, some case management, how to avoid scams as a homeowner, how to, get help in housing court for tenants, etc. And lastly, when we have public land that we're going to develop housing on, we do a lot of it community engagement about what should go on that land. So what the ground floor should be, what what levels of affordability should be in the building, etc. So when we have control over a public site, we want to make sure community's voice is heard there. Okay, so before we get started, just a little icebreaker to kind of get us thinking about fair housing. Um, First of all, a lot of you have already put in the chat, but if you haven't yet, maybe 30 seconds for folks just to say what community board you represent, who's in the room. And I've got my map of community boards in front of me, so I'll be Okay, I see where 6 is. I know where 14 is. We see you. Awesome. So great. My eyes are going all over the borough right now. This is great. Um, and so as you're thinking about this district that you represent, what are some reasons that people would choose to move to your district? Because we're going to start thinking about choice a little bit. What draws people to your district? Is it, you know, the housing conditions or the affordability? Is it, a sense of community? Are there businesses or that people really like? Parks, transit access, that's a great one. Sense of community. I'm seeing green space coming up a couple times. Okay, so these are kind of some of the attributes of like a neighborhood people would choose to move to. And what makes it hard for people to stay in your district? Um, okay, so someone mentioned gentrification, affordability, high rents. Someone said Coney Island, which maybe means, well, I would love to live in Coney Island, but maybe transit act far away, lack of affordability. Okay, great. So yeah, the confluence of poor maintenance and high prices. That's a sometimes feels like a uniquely New York thing. Um, so what I think we're getting at with this conversation is just that fair housing, it's about a lot of complicated issues, but a lot of what we talk about when we talk about it is choice, housing and neighborhood choice. And especially as New Yorkers, it can often feel like the choice of where we live is not entirely up to us. Whether it's because of price or, so many other reasons. And so we're going to take a step back and look at how for many people in America, where they live has never been dictated by their own preferences due to structural forces at federal, state, municipal, community levels, which have severely limited residential options for people for much of the 20th century, specifically people of color, people with disability, low income folks. While at the same time, policies have created a lot of wealth building for namely white Americans, at least in the middle of the century. And then kind of look at how on the local level, community boards have a role in our Where We Live plan, which hopes to uphold the city's commitment to fair housing goals. So this Where We Live plan, we're going to talk about it more in depth a little bit later, but it came out in 2020, and it analyzed historic and contemporary trends after asking over 700 New Yorkers in over 15 languages how they felt about fair housing issues in the city, and ultimately these goals created this plan with 6 big goals and a bunch of commitments. So we'll get there, but first, we'll take a step back, and just like the plan does, we'll first grapple with some of the history and concepts that we talk about when we talk about fair housing. So first, we'll look a little bit into the history and illuminate the struggle for fair housing on the local and federal level. And then we will talk about patterns of segregation in the city and still today. And I'm going to present some concepts. And then after I present the concept, you're going to see a bubble pop up. And it's just going to say who's responsible for this? Who's involved with this? And when you see that prompt, feel free to throw some ideas in the chat. Some of them will be fairly obvious, but if you have some more interesting answer, feel free to go ahead. We just kind of want to, as we're talking through this, really think about the complex web of actors who are involved in both, some of the really big problems we talk about, but also potentially to be engaged in the solutions. So first, we'll talk about red line. I think many people are likely familiar with the concept. Like this map of Brooklyn that you see here were drawn up. Maps like this were drawn up by the Homeowners Loan Corporation during the Depression.
Thank you.
And Redline saw the government play an outsized role in orchestrating where there would be racially concentrated areas of affluence and also poverty. And they did this by coding areas where ultimately the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, would underwrite loans. I think Pauline is maybe unmuted, and Angelo. If you could mute, that would be awesome.
I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you too. Would you mind muting?
Muting?
Thank you so much.
Hold on a
Um,
second.
And so, thank you. And so with government assurance, basically, banks, mortgage brokers, other lenders were able to offer really generous terms to developers and homeowners, provided that they were building in white areas or were white themselves. So these maps are a pretty powerful symbol of how the government and banks effectively chose winners and losers of investment. And the way this played out in New York is, this is coinciding with the development of a lot of housing further out from the Manhattan core into the suburbs. And so kind of these opportunities were largely not available to folks cut off from the subsidized financing. And usually the determination of if an area was kind of worthy of this financing or not was demographic makeup. So these maps are a pretty strong symbol of how the government and banks and others chose winners and losers. I think another example is this is called the Burwood Wall or the 8 Mile Wall. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Detroit, but this was built in the 40s. Basically, someone wanted to build a all white subdivision in Detroit, a little neighborhood, but banks were concerned that it was too close to a black red line neighborhood with majority African Americans, and the government wouldn't back the loan. And so the developers constructed a 6 foot high wall between, that existing African American community and where they wanted to build their subdivision. And only after the wall was built were they able to secure these loans to build the subdivision. So that is just an example of a red line on a map that was literally made concrete. Um, so if you have some thoughts, throw them in the chat about who redlines. And I do put it in present day because some form of redlining still does happen. But when you think of who is responsible for redlining, um, who comes to mind? Who are some of the actors here? All right. I'm seeing landlords, developers, real estate agents. Okay. Keep them coming. Um, And then, another big topic to think about is zoning, which we all, have some familiarity with, because, where many of these developers were getting loans to build were largely in the growing suburbs or suburban areas of cities, where single family zoning predominated. And at this point in history, it's pretty hard to separate single family zoning from some more explicitly racist policies like redlining. In the early 20th century, cities like Baltimore, Louisville, Miami actually had racial zoning that dictated what city blocks members of certain races could or could not move to. This picture you see on the screen, this is from St. Louis campaign to establish racial zoning in the city. Save your home, vote for segregation. And it actually did pass. But then racial zoning was struck down by the Supreme Court. But a lot of urban planners, like the ones in St. Louis, found that prohibiting the construction of anything other than single family homes in white neighborhoods was a way to achieve essentially the same end. And in Berkeley, California, which had the first ever single family zoning ordinance, the ordinance stated that its aim was to, quote, protect against the intrusion of the less desirable and floating renter class. So kind of a way to ensure that certain types of housing and thus certain type of people would not relocate to the cities. Um, so yeah, who plays a role in local zoning ordinances? And I'll let some of those thoughts come in, but I'm gonna keep going. Local government definitely plays a role, and the city council for sure. So like I said, zoning, you couldn't technically do racial zoning, right? That couldn't be written into the text, but you could certainly write racially restrictive covenants into the deeds of properties and contracts of homes and planned communities. So we see here on the screen above the photo is the racially restrictive covenant that was written into the contract that people moving into Levittown on Long Island had to sign on to. And, you know, the Supreme Court ultimately said that these covenants were unenforceable. They wouldn't enforce them in a court. But the Federal Housing Administration and other lenders looked upon them favorably and were more likely to lend to you if you had a covenant like this because it would safeguard against demographic change. And they saw that as something that would depreciate your property value. So many deeds to individual homes across the country still have these covenants in them. It's not just a Levittown thing. And, you know, it's important to, I think, remember with something like this that the deal that folks were getting when they moved out to Levittown, this opportunity to build generational wealth, often with zero down, especially if you were a veteran, and then paying monthly costs that were usually less than what renters were paying back in the city. So, I mean, these places were places of enormous opportunity, but just not evenly distributed opportunity. So who established these covenants? Who kept this system of racially restrictive covenants alive that we still see today, technically, in the documents of some people's houses? So I noticed in some of the responses we've moved from a pretty high level, you know, of government and developers, and now we're getting down to individual homeowners and communities as well, but still connected to, you know, to some larger policy. And then lastly, I just want to say that what we just talked about, it should not be seen as immune to multifamily housing or the city. It's not just a suburban problem. When Stuyvesant Town on the east side of Manhattan was developed, the insurance company MetLife um, established under the principle that, quote, blacks and whites do not mix. So this was built with public money. It offered very favorable terms to veterans who were moving in, actually including my own grandparents. And they accessed green space, modern amenities, and stability. And none of that was offered to Black and Brown New Yorkers. And when the residents themselves actually sued to integrate the development, this fight went all the way to the New York Supreme Court, and this is before the Fair Housing Act. And so the Supreme Court said housing accommodation is not a civil right. MetLife can legally discriminate. Segregation in housing is not illegal, which kind of just hints at the need for something like a Fair Housing Act. And so, you know, public housing in New York City was also officially segregated before white flight left a lot of vacancies in projects, and public money was used to fund all sorts of segregated projects. So we don't really have time to go into every single practice here, but we've been talking about a lot of who. You've been saying, you know, who are the actors here, but we can also talk about when. So, you know, when in the course of housing provision was discrimination at play? Well, every stage, and it was sanctioned by all the actors you've put in the chat. And of course, given the attitudes toward the red line neighborhoods and the people who lived in them, it's not surprising that they could be deemed blighted. And then, you know, that gave the city kind of credence to demolish them if they were, you know, not even just full of people of color per se, but many integrated neighborhoods. And so in the name of urban renewal or clearing these blighted neighborhoods, cities were able to destroy them to make way for priority projects, many of which we benefit from, but such as highways, entertainment facilities, middle-class housing, often public housing, but never really enough, you know, to correspond to the amount of people who had left, who had been forced to leave the neighborhood. And so given what we know about redlining, it often meant that folks were dispersed and then concentrated in the ever fewer places available to them to live, if they were, particularly if they were people of color. For example, to create Lincoln Center, that saw the displacement of 7,000 families, almost all who were Black and Hispanic, along with 800 businesses. And up on the screen, just to tie it back to Brooklyn, this is a site where around almost 400 buildings were cleared to make way just in a section of Greenpoint for the BQE. And a lot of their stuff, the stuff in their house, they didn't have time to take. So if you've ever been down to Dead Horse Bay in South Brooklyn, this is where, you know, there was some sloppy landfilling going on where they took a lot of people's stuff, landfilled it, but it's been washing up on the beach. And a lot of people will say it's trash, but a lot of it actually goes back to this time of slum clearance, and it's the pieces of people's lives, bottles, boots, whatever, that they couldn't take with them when their homes were being destroyed. So you can still find those today. But New Yorkers are not passive people. New Yorkers fought back against urban renewal. On the screen here, this is from a campaign in the Bronx to stop the Cross Bronx from going through areas where people's homes were marked for demolition. People fought back against discrimination. The picture on the left is from Midwood, where people sat in at housing that was only being leased up to white tenants, and also at Stuyvesant Town, where it was the residents themselves who sued to integrate, who fought their own landlord, and who actually illegally would sublet to families of color, even though it was against the rules. And this was kind of a local channel of a much larger civil rights timeline for housing. So I think folks, a lot of folks are familiar with the Civil Rights and Voting Acts of 1964, 1965, which prohibited discrimination in so many aspects of American life, thinking about job employment and schooling, et cetera, and voting. But housing actually was not included there. And a lot of people thought that housing was just too hard to do, that a lot of these other things, especially for northern legislators, Congress people, they could say, oh, the Southerners need to change their ways. But if they were really going to look at housing discrimination, they would have to look at their own northern neighborhoods. And that was just a little too uncomfortable for people. And so that's why Martin Luther King's first major northern campaign was about housing. He went to Chicago, the Chicago Freedom Movement. And the campaign was really focused on things that folks are focused on today, about opening up housing opportunities in, segregated neighborhoods, about ending real estate discrimination, about building more publicly subsidized housing. And ultimately, after King was assassinated in 1968, like immediately after, the Fair Housing Act was finally passed. So big buildup, but the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting, buying, or securing financing or housing. And a lot of these practices we talked about, like redlining, steering prospective buyers to different houses based on the color of their skin, they're explicitly called out in this act. And federal law calls out these 7 protected classes. You cannot discriminate based on race, color, religion, etc. But here in New York, we actually protect additional classes. Does anyone, before I reveal, does anyone want to throw in the chat a guess of what you don't see under the federal law that we protect here in New York? Who it's illegal to discriminate against in New York, but not elsewhere potentially? Sexual orientation. Someone said immigration status. Yep. Okay. And there's a pretty big one. Okay. I think Corey's leading us there. So yeah, all the things people mentioned, and including sexual orientation, gender identity, citizenship. But someone said occupation. I think that's really important for what we're going to talk about in a bit, because lawful source of income or occupation includes being a voucher holder, right? So in New York, you cannot refuse to accept a voucher, technically. And also, things like your experience as a survivor of domestic violence is covered in New York, but not necessarily elsewhere. And also in the 80s, reasonable accommodations and modifications for people living with disabilities was added to the act. So new multifamily housing constructed from the 90s onward had to meet accessibility requirements. Something like in this ad where a light switch would be placed, to really essential accommodations to, or modifications to, let's say there's a no pet policy, but someone needs a service animal, or someone needs to live on the first floor. All these things are covered under the Fair Housing Act. Okay, So we talked about history and we talked about the problems that the Fair Housing Act was designed to solve. Um, can anyone throw in the chat some barriers to fair housing today? Some of the things you see in your day to day representing your community and your board, or just as a resident of your community, that echo some of the things we've talked about today, some of the history we talked about. I'll give folks like 25, 30 seconds. Credit requirements, lack of investment in our housing stock, and which housing stock gets invested and which doesn't, the consequences of redlining still being with us. Okay, so people are talking about financial institutions refusing people potentially based on a protected class characteristic. Someone said resistance to new housing development, so not expanding the choice for where people can live. Awesome. So we're gonna dip into the Where We Live plan now. So the maps you see, and more importantly, the quotes that you're gonna see are from the community engagement process from Where We Live. So New York, probably the most diverse city in the country, but a highly segregated one. And as we just saw, a lot of that segregation has been shaped by a legacy of intentional policies and practices. But also, what we heard a lot from folks in Where We Live is, they don't necessarily mind that they live in a community surrounded by people who share their language or culture, and that integration is something they value, because there's a perception that not everyone is getting the same things. So this person said, it's not a bad thing to be integrated and it's not a bad thing to be separated. The bad thing is that when we pay our fair share and we're not getting the equal things. Or other folks said, if integration means that my neighborhood's getting gentrified, I don't want integration, right? So I think what people were pointing to was just this sense of unequal access to opportunity and also to consequences. And so we see in New York a lot of examples of unequal access to opportunity. The example right here is broadband internet access by community district. So, this essential element of life in the 21st century. You have huge, pockets of the city that have much lower access to internet. And on the flip side, unequal outcomes, right? So some of this historic disinvestment in red line neighborhoods, where transit infrastructure like highways or noxious industries were cited, lead to disproportionate consequences. Here we see asthma hospitalization rates by neighborhoods. So we're seeing neighborhoods in Eastern Brooklyn, the South Bronx, lighting up a lot more heavily, whereas certain other neighborhoods have relatively few asthma hospitalizations. And people here are getting at, we kind of look at the same neighborhoods that are dark blue on this map, this is a map of where basically someone making 60% of the area median income could afford to live. That's around $75,000 for family 3 or less. And so we're seeing, that the lack of affordability across the city kind of mirrors a lot of the concentration of where, consequences of segregation are. And also just, if people can't choose to leave their neighborhood because of, because of cost, at a certain point that becomes a fair housing issue. And one way to solve that fair housing issue would be, building more affordable housing. And as I said, at HPD, we've been involved with about 50,000 new affordable homes in the past, since 2014, an additional kind of 100,000 preserved. But most of that housing is still getting built in the same areas where there already is housing that people can afford. So we're not expanding necessarily where people can live with new affordable housing, for a variety of reasons. People pointed at opposition to housing, new housing. Also, you know, the affordable housing accounts for just a tiny slice of all the housing that gets built in the city, and new housing without any government subsidy is often going to be expensive. So the affordable housing, you know, is in these areas with already a lot of low cost housing. But we talked a little bit about vouchers, right, and sorts of income discrimination. So one way to expand opportunity for folks is to get a housing voucher, housing choice voucher, which basically, you know, the premise is you pay 30% of your income towards your rent. The government's going to pay the rest. And, you know, in New York, we allow that amount to go up relatively high. So you should be able to live in a wide variety of neighborhoods. But what we heard from folks when we talked to them and where we live was that a landlord would often say to them, I don't take vouchers. I don't want those kinds of people. We got a ton of comments like this. And as I said, it is actually illegal in New York to say that to somebody. But of course it happens. Or that people experienced kind of the opposite of housing choice, which is that, you know, this is a Brooklynite, as many of us in here are, someone who lived in Brooklyn for 40 years. They really wanted to use their Section 8 voucher in Brooklyn, but it was a time limit. They needed to find a place to go. And the only place they really found to use it was in Far Rockaway, which is a neighborhood they'd never lived in, and it's very far away from their community. So that's what we talked to people about, and the data really, you know, kind of illuminated some of that for us, that, you know, 100,000 plus New Yorkers are using housing choice vouchers, and technically they can use them with any private landlord anywhere in the city. However, again, we're seeing some of the same areas of concentration. That would be the darker colors, where a higher share of renters are renting using housing vouchers. And, you know, it's not evenly distributed across the city at all. And the New York City Commission on Human Rights cites this as the most frequent form of housing discrimination. And if you know of someone who's been denied housing because of using a voucher, that the Commission of Human Rights is definitely great people to get in touch with. We also heard about disability discrimination. So, you know, since the 80s, folks with disabilities have been included in the Fair Housing Act. But much like with vouchers, you have these kind of dual things where someone's girlfriend went to look at an apartment. They didn't have any problems, but when they saw that person would be living with someone who had a cane, they suddenly had a problem, and they lost their chance at that housing. Or someone mentions having a motorized wheelchair and wanting a modification made to their building to accommodate them, but the landlord wouldn't put a ramp in because he said it would bring down the value of the building. Okay, so all these things, right? Some of these things are still kind of blatant discrimination like we've seen in the past, but I think it's important to understand some of the, you know, the broader patterns of discrimination, the legacy perhaps, or even things like the unaffordability to so many people to access many neighborhoods. We have to care about these things because of something called affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the Fair Housing Act doesn't just say it's illegal to blatantly discriminate against people. It says we have to use our kind of federally funded, you know, cities, places like New York have to overcome patterns of segregation. So we're obligated to try to expand housing choice to areas that have high opportunity, but also to equitably invest in neighborhoods that have historically been disinvested in, because, you know, we want not only to expand housing choice, but to make every neighborhood a choice neighborhood, right? But this is a pretty like high level conceptual thing that's much harder to deal with than just you can't say no to that person because of the color of their skin, right? And because of that, almost nothing has ever happened with affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and it was not till 1994 that the federal government even really tried to take a look at this and say, how can we operationalize this? How can we, you know, try to make sure that cities are taking steps to dismantle patterns of segregation? And so, you know, 1994, Clinton kind of issues some guidance on it, but it wasn't until the Obama administration that they released a rule about how AFFH could actually work, about how you could create tools to analyze whether places were trying to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and actually some real consequences if they weren't. For example, if you receive community development block grants from the federal government, you could, that money could be taken away if you were not in compliance and trying to fund projects that would integrate communities. The president who came after Obama repealed AFFH, so Trump was not a big fan of it. And then Biden brought it back. So it's kind of hard to describe how AFFH could be enacted. So I'll try to use an example, kind of a first of its kind real enforcement of the principles of AFFH. It happened just to the north of the city in Westchester. Basically, in 2009, HUD filed a lawsuit against Westchester that said they accepted over $52 million in HUD funding over the years. And because they accepted it under the premise that they would affirmatively furthering fair housing, they were not building any new housing, multifamily housing in predominantly white communities. And so HUD basically said, you took this money under false pretenses. And so they mandated that Westchester had to build over 750 units of affordable housing in the areas that are shaded blue on this map. And those areas are predominantly white and single family zone parts of Westchester. So they had pretty much the entirety of Westchester to be eligible to build in. And the only place they couldn't build were in the communities where this kind of housing was already concentrated. So to meet this goal, Westchester, for example, proposed an affordable housing development that was in the city of Rye. And the city of Rye would show up blue on that map. So they would be eligible to build there. It's a community that's predominantly white, predominantly single family zoned. Except that where they chose to build it was right on the town line with the city of Port Chester. And the city of Port Chester was a place that already had a lot of multifamily housing. It was only 28% white, and it did not qualify as a place that they were eligible to build this housing. And if you can see on this picture, the site they chose, it's at the very end of the city of Rye, but it's basically in Port Chester because there are two interstate highways separating the site from the rest of the city of Rye, the area of opportunity that these tenants were supposed to be able to access. And instead, they basically built it in Port Chester. And this pattern happened at a lot. And I just bring this up not to rag on Westchester, but just to show how hard it is if people aren't really bought in on wanting to the spirit of integration or spreading opportunity. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is just an incredibly complicated thing to do. But at its heart, there's a balance between place-based strategies, so really wanting to focus revitalization efforts and investment in places where there was historic disinvestment, and mobility strategies, so wanting to create opportunities for people to move where they want to move. So how is New York City doing that? I talked about the Where We Live plan. I'm going to go through this fast so we can get to the questions. But keep in mind that balanced approach I just talked about, the sense of mixing mobility strategies with place-based strategies. And so these are the big goals of Where We Live. We'll get into them one by one, so I won't read them all. But these are what came out of the process we talked about. Wanting to both facilitate new housing development for choice while preventing displacement, while making rental assistance vouchers go farther, et cetera. And a lot of this is echoed in this administration's blueprint for housing. So if you've read that, there's a lot of overlap with the Where We Live plan. So there's new city funding to tackle sources of income discrimination and plans to kind of try to add new protected classes basically for folks who've had criminal justice involvement. So that's still a reason that you can be rejected by a landlord legally, and also to address discrimination by co-op associations, who often don't have to reveal the reason that that they're not accepting an applicant. That there's thoughts of bringing that under fair housing, of making them be more transparent. Some of the recent neighborhood rezonings that have happened in places like Gowanus and Soho, have been under the assumption that bringing new housing opportunities there will inevitably lead to people who weren't able to come into those places to move there. And also on the flip side, giving people more opportunity to become homeowners. So the city had a down payment assistance program that was in the tens of thousands, but it's been raised to $100,000 for a down payment assistance for low-income home buyers. And then, a big issue, people brought up gentrification, a big issue in a lot of neighborhoods that were formerly redlined, but now are valuable. And who's often left behind are long-term tenants, or tenants living in rent-stabilized buildings are under disinvestment or harassment. So the city has developed new programs, some of our existing programs like legal support, but also a new program called Partners in Preservation, which actually sees the city partnering with tenant associations and community-based organizations to try to create new tenant associations, especially in rent-stabilized buildings, so that tenants specifically in neighborhoods that are seeing a lot of development pressure are, organized and can combat that. And then more for voucher holders in general. So some of that can include counseling. Sometimes someone said, if you give me a voucher and then you don't do anything else, it's like giving me a key to a VW and then saying, go find it somewhere on the street. So they're trying to have more wraparound services, more mobility counseling for voucher holders. And at HPD, we're increasing the number of units in our buildings that are specifically set aside for people coming from shelter with vouchers. The kind of thing about the handing me the key to the VW really applies also to folks with disabilities, especially on our Housing Connect housing lottery. Is often really hard for folks to navigate. So there's been an expansion of accessibility for the Housing Ambassador program, and expanding opportunities for seniors and people with disabilities to obtain home modifications so they can stay in the places they already live. And then lastly, this goal 6, make equitable investments. This is really that community-based revitalization piece of fair housing. It's not just about fair housing. It's about things like renovating green space, trying to explore the fact that renters could build credit, tying which schools to give limited funding to if they are in places with historic disinvestment, and everything to bus service. So obviously these are huge things, but they all do tie into a fair housing vision. And I'll have Renee drop in the chat. One of the tools that we love to advocate for folks to use to advocate for their own neighborhood is something called the Equitable Development Data Explorer, which was a commitment of Where We Live that has come out, and you can see a lot of the kind of data about who's in your community, what rents are, if people are at displacement risk, and even break down a lot of census data that people are used to seeing, but you can break it down by race. So it's really impactful tool. You should use it to fight the city. So I want to get to Q&A, so I'm gonna pretty much end here. But the reason we're talking to you is because I just see a major overlap between the work community boards do and this vision. So if we're talking about advocating for investment in your communities, that kind of goal 6 thing, you do a district needs assessment. You are there saying, this is the transit route that isn't working for people. This is the park that needs to be updated, et cetera. When we're talking about, making more facilitating equitable development across the city, these are the very land use changes that are going to come to you through the ULERT process. So we see you as a key actor in the process of expanding housing opportunity. And lastly, one of your roles is to educate and involve your neighbors in public policy decisions. That's why we want you to be part of this conversation. You are part of the city, part of the city charter. You are enacting where we live just as much as we are. And you connect your neighbors to resources and information. So we have some information about what to do if people are coming to you with discrimination complaints. Definitely reach out to us. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I know I've done a lot of talking, and I want to get right to your questions. So I'll ask Renee. Renee has been collecting your questions from the chat. I'll ask Renee to give like 3 questions, and then we'll go to folks raising their hands and kind of go back and forth until we run out of time. Take it away, Renee.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, really simple softball, Charlie. Will we be sharing the presentation?
Yes, Carol Ann will send it to you all.
Before. Oh, here it is.
Great. Several folks. And we will definitely also share our emails in the chat, and would encourage folks, if you have questions that we didn't get to tonight or questions that come up after, that you please email us. We would be very happy to be in touch. So a wide variety of questions. We'll just start with one I saw a few minutes ago about money for source of income discrimination and addressing violations of source of income discrimination. So the question was asked before Charlie spoke to goal 1 of where we live, where he pointed out that the city did last March actually announce an additional $3 million to address source of income discrimination. So that's funding that is going to fund testing, where they essentially try to identify landlords or brokers who are treating prospective tenants in discriminatory ways. There was a question about, are those funds subject to the PEG? I do not know. As far as I know, the programs that are subject to the 15% have not been finalized yet, so can't speak to that. Do you want to go to a hand now, Charlie?
Let's do one more from the chat.
Okay, great. Just saw a question now about the Equitable Development Data Explorer and displacement risk. So the question was, can you explain how the displacement risk map is sort of measured, how that tool is measuring displacement risk, and concerns that that tool is not capturing sort of actual displacement or people's experience of being pushed out, and how can we best combat displacement in the city. So I'll take the first question and then hand it over to Charlie to talk about how we can prevent displacement. So, without getting too complicated, the displacement risk map is looking at 3 kind of categories of potential inputs to a neighborhood's displacement risk. And to be really clear, it does not measure the displacement risk of an individual person or an individual household. It's looking at a neighborhood, and it's looking at, are there population vulnerabilities in this community? Are there people who are sort of based on their household characteristics more at risk? So that would be something like having high rent burden. It looks at the housing conditions in that neighborhood. So that's things like, are there a lot of rent stabilized homes there? Is there a lot of public housing there? Are there a lot of renters? Because we know renters tend to be more at risk than homeowners. And it looks at market pressure to say, hey, are housing prices going way up more than the rest of the city? Or has there been a larger influx of college-educated young adults? Because that has been associated with sort of gentrification or displacement. So it kind of combines all of those factors. It does not evaluate sort of have people been pushed out so far, for the simple fact that it's essentially impossible for us to know that. That does not mean that people's lived experience and stories and what you may know from living on your block or living in your neighborhood is not real. It's very real. It's just, unfortunately, we can't measure that and measure it equally across all neighborhoods, and so incorporate it into a tool like this. So I'll hand it over to Charlie. Do you want to talk a little bit about how we think about preventing displacement? Because that's certainly the best thing we can do to address displacement is stop it before it starts.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, one thing is just, preservation, which is a big part of our name. When we talk about housing preservation, it's not like historic preservation, it's preserving affordability. So the kind of places that New Yorkers are already living that are at risk of, becoming not affordable housing because, the building can't be maintained, et cetera. That is where most of our financing has gone, is to preserving affordability. And in the housing that we preserved, the majority of it was for folks making below 50% of AMI. Those were those units. I'm sorry, I hate talking in AMIs. That's about like folks making basically below $60,000 for a family of three. And significantly many units below that are in the housing we preserve. And so a lot of these older buildings are in these neighborhoods that are at risk for displacement, um, or where there's much more greater incentive from the market for people to build luxury housing. Our financing can offer landlords something where they can keep a building that has affordable rents, they can keep it well maintained, and they can keep folks in the building. And then I would say the city, has invested in housing court help for tenants, legal support and otherwise, because if you show up to housing court with a lawyer, your chances of fighting an eviction are just astronomically higher, for example. And lastly, and yeah, I would say like we don't have all the tools to do that all the time, but those are just some of the ways we think about preventing displacement. And then let's see. I see a hand up that's been for a while. I'm gonna call on first, Dean.
Yes, good evening. I've attended a couple of symposiums over the past few years regarding affordable housing, and two things I want to mention. First, that new buildings that are basically not subsidized in building them with government money are very expensive. People at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum cannot afford them. But the other point was made that, and I want to get your opinion on this, there's like a six-tier process where people at the upper end move into, let's call it a luxury building, and they move out of an apartment in, let's say, tier 5. Then tier 5 will move up because there's an affordable housing for them. Tier 4 will move up. And as you go down like 6 steps, people at the lower end of the, with economic ladder, let's say, are actually able to move into housing that is quote unquote better than what they have and more affordable. So do you think there's some legitimacy to that? Is that monitored by HPD? I just wanted to get your opinion on that. I mean, it sounds logical, but I mean, I don't know, how deep that goes.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dean. And I think you're bringing up, I think some folks call that filtering, where like, if there's enough housing supply, people can filter up through different types of housing. I think HPD, there is definitely some research that supports this kind of on the regional level, but it's not definitely not happening overnight, and it's definitely not happening like on the block level, right? Like, so I feel like it's hard for people to think about something like that when they're like, well, I just saw a luxury building go up on my block and now everyone's rent is higher, so how is that working, right? Like, I think to the extent that this is true, it's definitely at a much larger scale and over a much longer period of time. I think what I would say is, because HPD's slice of housing in New York is so small, 2/3 of housing or more is just built with no subsidy and with no affordability requirements. We have tried, through things like mandatory inclusionary housing, through some tax incentives that exist, little ways that get some income restricted affordable housing into the market rate developments, means that, I think it benefits affordable housing for there to be in general more housing development. Um, so I think to that extent, like, if if an area is rezoned to allow for more housing, and that means that suddenly new buildings qualify for mandatory inclusionary housing and you can get some units in there that are below market rate, then, that's been a successful use of new housing development. But I think we also really acknowledge that if you look at the rental market in New York City, there is a very high vacancy rate or relatively high
Mhm.
vacancy rate for units that rent for like $2,300 and above. And there is an almost non-existing vacancy rate for units that rent for, even $1,200 and below, right? And so we still are very concerned with getting more actually lower rent units on the market. And, we definitely do not see overnight that more expensive units are making all those other ones cheaper or cheaper ones more available
Right.
necessarily.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And then I saw um, Suki had a hand up for a while.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a few specific questions that pertain to some of the older and rent stabilized buildings. The first is, can you talk a little bit about disability modifications, like not just ramps, but a lot of times the issues for wheelchairs is the size of hallways and doorways. And I feel like there is some sort of rule that if the landlord is significantly renovating the building, that they have to make those modifications, but they don't always do it. We've seen a lot of these buildings in Flatbush and PLG where the landlord somehow managed to like renovate, a whole bunch of apartments, but they're still not wheelchair accessible. And then the second question is, like when there's a fire in a building, whether it's accidental or otherwise, and then we see the landlord like working, it's boarded up for ages and ages. Are there any rules that require the landlord to fix it and put people back in a timely fashion? Because a lot of times it's rent stabilized tenants, and then if they can keep them out for a certain amount of time, they can't come back in. And then the third thing is when HPD does do some preservation in a building, like there's one building on my block that got an HPD loan. Um, does the does the agreement, like how long does the affordability agreement with the landlord last? And if it was like a total renovation, does that let the landlord get out of stabilization eventually after their agreement with HPD expires? So I guess that's enough for now. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna start with the last question first,
Okay.
just because it's also a good explainer about any when we get into regulatory agreements. So for our new housing and our preservation housing, actually a lot of units that weren't rent stabilized before end up entering rent stabilization. So part of when we say affordable housing, we mean that those units are restricted to certain incomes and they are rent stabilized. So if a landlord's in a regulatory agreement with us, it means that those units are rent stabilized. So no, they wouldn't be out of rent stabilization. And then those agreements, it really depends on which kind of program they're using or how the finance working, but generally would not be less than 30 years. Would likely be at minimum longer than that. And then with our preservation programs, we're usually coming back to those building owners halfway through and just basically signing a new agreement to keep it going. So those tend to just go on for into perpetuity basically, but I would say there'd never be less than 30 years and those units would be rent stabilized. And then Renee maybe can speak to the accommodations modifications question you had.
Yeah, it's not going to be the most satisfying answer, Suki. I will say that reasonable accommodations in housing and small modifications are absolutely required. But there are larger modifications that I think a property owner can say would not could not reasonably be accommodated due to cost potentially, or sort of the physical constraints of the building. I didn't quite catch the second part of your question. What were you were saying something about modifications happening that aren't
So
ultimately.
like a lot of times, like the width of hallways or doorways is an issue, and I feel like I've seen some kind of rule, but I'm not sure that if the landlord is already renovating a certain percentage of the units or a certain number of units, that they have to make these disability modifications, or if they're like doing a complete renovation of a particular unit, that they have to make it that they have to do disability modifications. And so I'm just wondering if you know about that, if that's being communicated to landlords.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think best is I will get back to you if you can.
Okay.
I'll put my email in the chat if you'll email me. I think you're right. If it would depend on the size of the building, and the number of units in the building, and the kinds of renovations that are being made. But I would love to dig more in the weeds and get in touch with some colleagues who are more familiar with the details.
Okay, that'd be great. And then my third question was about the fires and tenants getting back in.
Yeah, and are you speaking getting back into the home where a fire occurred?
Right, like if it's a rent stabilized building and there's some
Yeah.
kind of fire or accident, like can the landlord just delay fixing it forever? Is there some kind of rule that requires them to fix it in a timely fashion and bring the tenants back?
I do not know the rules that are governing that. I think if your concern is that they would leave, I mean, it would obviously remain rent stabilized. If the concern is that they would sort of leave it vacant in perpetuity, I think there are obviously issues that people are aware of around warehousing and things like that. So I'm not sure what legal
Because
requirements they're
we
under.
heard somewhere that if the landlord keeps them out for 4 years or more, that it can become destabilized. I don't know if that's true or not, but like in any case, if they're even, for whatever reason, keeping it empty for an extremely long time and not fixing it, is there any way that we can require them to?
Yeah, I'm not familiar. The state actually is the entity that governs rent stabilization.
Okay.
So that would be a state law through Homes
Okay.
and Community Renewal, which is the state agency. But again, I can look into this. Absolutely, I have colleagues here who are more connected with the specifics.
Okay,
Ms.
that'd be
Charlie,
great.
do you have any inside knowledge on that?
Only that loophole sounds like something that post 2019 law that strengthened rent stabilization in general may have closed if it existed. But definitely don't want to speak out of turn about that. Also, I mean, in general, because, our code enforcement officers do enforce the housing code, if that person is still a landlord of those tenants and is not providing them something that they're obligated to provide them, there still could be grounds for them being fined and really needing to rehouse those people before the code enforcement is on their case really big in a big way. But like to get you like concrete answer on that.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Should I drop my email in the chat or?
Yeah, if you
It's probably just
go
to
ahead.
reach out actually directly to us, just because the chat is
Okay.
Yeah.
extensive tonight. So we'll drop our emails to make sure we
Okay,
don't lose
thank
track.
you.
Can you share that answer with everybody though? That's a really good question that Suki was asking.
Yeah, we can certainly send it out to Carol Ann.
Sure.
Okay. Do you want to go, Caroline? I know we're at over, so how much longer do you want us to go?
We actually said 7:15,
Oh,
and
okay.
I think we can go, as long as you want to go on their questions, I'm okay.
All right, Renee, do you want to go back to the chat
Yeah, I
questions?
think just, we spent some time talking about rental housing and owner-occupied housing. So just want to bring up a question about, someone asked, why is it that almost all affordable housing is rental? Have we considered incentivizing affordable condos or co-ops instead of rentals? Charlie, do you want to speak to the ownership programs, or do you want me to speak to that?
You go ahead first.
Yeah, so there are a few different things going on here, but it's true that the majority of the units that HP finances are rental housing, and that's in part because we can finance much lower rents through rental housing, and so we can effectively subsidize more housing, which is really what we need in serious supply. But we also recognize the important sort of household and neighborhood and wealth building opportunities that ownership opportunities can generate. There's always the balance between sort of the wealth building aspect of home ownership and then the affordability levels. So if we subsidize an affordable unit, we kind of want it to stay affordable, so that the next tenant or the next resident can also sort of benefit from those subsidies. So that's why it becomes challenging with ownership to figure out how to balance, public subsidy going to an individual household that will sort of benefit from the wealth creation over time. But we do have some ownership programs, including community land trusts, which is something that the city is investing in and something that HPD is advancing. One project to look up that relates directly to our team, neighborhood planning, in Edgemere, Community Land Trust won an RFP to redevelop public land as a CLT. So those will be, and they're really kind of grappling with those ownership, wealth building and affordability tensions there. So happy to speak more to the specifics of the ownership programs. There's a program called Open Door right now. The ownership units don't come up as often on Housing Connect because they are more rare, but it is something we're trying to sort of balance with the needs of renters citywide. Other questions? Oh, also just Charlie, someone had asked a quick follow-up to your answer earlier about units becoming
Oh
rent
yeah.
stabilized.
Yeah, just to say that the basically that a lot of times people see housing that's called affordable housing and they're like, that doesn't seem affordable to me. And I think it's important to clarify that what we mean by affordable housing, as in when city subsidy is going to it, it means that it is income restricted, so it's tied to an income and it's rent stabilized. And so what I meant by that is, prior rent stabilization, it usually means that it's in a building that was built before 1974 and has 6 or more units. And so other than having a time machine, it's hard to create new rent stabilized units basically because the term rent stabilization was tied to it being in an older building. But we actually add units to the rent stabilization rules when they're in one of our programs because all of our units are rent stabilized. That's all I was saying.
Yeah, and I would just add that applies to units built through the mandatory inclusionary housing program as well, which are sort of permanently affordable units. I feel like we've had one hand up for a long time, maybe more. Do you want to take that as the last question?
Sure. And who is that?
I'm just seeing Angelo. Do you have a question? Can't hear you, but do you want to come off mute?
Can you hear him now?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes. Hi, my name is Angelo Bruno. I'm on Community Board 11. I want to thank Charlie and Renee. And I want to say hello to Mrs. Church. She is always glad to see her. I'm a little bit older than some of the group pictures right now you're looking at on your screen. I have a lot of younger people coming to me and saying that it's so expensive to live in Brooklyn that they're leaving. They're trying to raise a family. I'm on the community board here, and I'm on a community in a garden apartments I live in, and they just can't afford, and they're making good salaries. They just can't keep up with the times, maybe having 1 or 2 children. And every time I see the same person, well, Angelo, I'm moving. Who's going to Florida? Who's going to Tennessee? Who's going to Maine? And I was just hoping there would be some kind of programs that try to keep the people in New York instead of us losing this young generation. I was wondering if you have any information that you could give me on this.
Yeah, I think the type of the situation you're talking about is partly why, when we finance, most 95, I think, percent of the housing that we finance is for folks making below 80% of the area median income. And that goes up to like $100,000 for a family of three. And a lot of it is, for much less than that. But I think what you're getting at is folks who anywhere else in the country would be considered to be making a perfectly good middle class salary to afford any of the housing, can't afford housing in New York City. And I think that's part of the reason why some of our, affordable housing goes to some people who make salaries that, people will often say like that person doesn't need a subsidized unit. They make a good amount of money, but that good amount of money doesn't go as far in New York. So I think what I would say to you, and I'm not sure in your district if we have many HPD finance projects in District 11 specifically, but that like it's partly why for some of our programs there's a wide range of incomes, because it's not just the lowest income person, but also someone who wants to move back to, let's say, the neighborhood they grew up in, but the type of home they grew up in is not a type of home they could afford. um, the market might not be building that housing, and we need to subsidize housing like that. I would also say part of that is behind the ADU, or accessory dwelling unit, proposal. I don't know if y'all are following the mayor's City of Yes zoning plan, but basically it's focused on low density districts, 1 2 family homes, where for, let's say, that kid moving back to the neighborhood, they could actually create a new unit at the parents' house, perhaps, and maybe the parents live there to age in place, and someone takes over the main house. But it's just creating more residential opportunities within even low density communities, so that people can move back to where they're from, or people can age in place where they live. Um, so those are two things that come to mind for me.
Thank you very much. And thank you for tonight. It was very knowledgeable. And thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Take my hand down.
Well, we do want to be respectful of people's time. I know there were a lot of other great questions in the chat and potentially some other hands raised. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. But really appreciate you being with us. Again, we're very happy to come talk to your individual boards as well. Charlie mentioned he's a fair housing planner. He is one of several in the last year or so new staff who have fair housing in their title. So that's part of what part of why we're able to offer this session, is that we're really trying to invest in engaging with community boards on these issues. You all play a very critical role in advancing fair housing across the city. So we'd love to come speak to your individual boards, your housing committees, land use committees anytime. So please do reach out. I dropped my info in the chat, and Charlie dropped his as well. And I'll hand it back to Carol Ann unless there's any final questions.
And I'll just say I'm going to drop also in the chat a survey. Just let us know how you felt about the presentation, what we could improve, etc. We'd love to know. And yeah, just echoing that we can come give this presentation, and also to come to do the Affordable Housing 101 to answer some of these more questions about how it all works. We can do that as well. Thank you so much. And Carol Ann, back to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie and Renee. Oh my gosh, this was really great. Coupled in this workshop was a lot of history. And for many of us probably now understand the systemic reasons why our housing is the way it is. So thank you so much for that, adding that to the presentation. I think this was really great in that the participants see how decisions made at the community board. Somebody's not muted. How decisions made at the community board can really impact the state of housing in their district. So I think this was great. Thank you also very much, Charlie and Renee, and the HPD HPD team behind the scenes. Thank you to my IT people for being on and ensuring that there are no technology issues, and if there are, that they could be here to assist with that. And thank you to the members who gave up with their time this evening, all for community to do this. Just letting you know, the next session in our trainings will be November 16th, and we'll be talking about preservation, historic preservation, and how to review those applications, what it is the commission is looking for, and how our resolutions can be written to get what we'd like to get out of them. So with that, I say good night, everyone. Have a wonderful week.
And a bunch of people.
Thank
night.
you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick Brown. Is it possible that you
We have
can
8 people
address veterans?
in the group so far.
Excuse someone saying
Good night,
something?
everybody. It was very informative.
I am, Ms. Church, this is Cleopatra Brown.
Jumped.
Is there possible that you can address veterans' preference on these housing? Because we see that there's nothing being spoke about in regards to veterans.
Are you talking about preferences when a project goes up?
Yes, veteran preferences when the project goes up. Because that is not being, we have a lot of veterans that's returning home to shelters. And that's unacceptable.
I will address that with HPD, but that's very likely could be a question, a much larger question on a matter of overall city policy, but we can ask if they're able, I see Charlie still on, if he's able to address that now, if that's a much bigger question for another time. Charlie?
Yeah, Cleopatra, that's a great question. I don't want to give a wrong answer. So, but I think there's definitely preferences in the housing library, you know, for community member, from the community board, and for folks with disabilities. But you often don't see veteran status, so I don't want to. I'm not sure if that's something we do. But I know there are other housing programs, whether it's from the you know, veteran services, et cetera, that can support veterans. But I'd love to be able to get back to you to tell you exactly what specifically the city can offer veterans or doesn't. So
Okay, I will appreciate that. Thank you, Ms. Church.
You're welcome,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Brown.
good night.
Ms.
Hey,
Church,
is
I'm
that
gonna
it?
see you Saturday. Ms. Church, I'm gonna see you Saturday.
I have a number of conflicts on Saturday, but I'll do my best.
Oh, okay.
Some of my other colleagues may join you though.
Oh, okay, all right.
Good night.
Good night.